Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, published in 2011, is a groundbreaking book that delves into the two systems of thought that drive human decision-making. Kahneman, a Nobel laureate in economic sciences, explores the cognitive biases and heuristics that influence our judgments and choices. The book is divided into 5 parts, each examining different aspects of human thinking and decision-making processes. Introduction. Kahneman begins by introducing the two systems of thinking, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, and intuitive, while System 2 is slow, deliberate, and analytical. Understanding the interplay between these systems is crucial for comprehending human behavior and decision-making. Part 1. Two systems. Chapter 1. The characters of the story. Kahneman introduces System 1 and System 2. System 1 operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. System 2 allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, including complex computations. The operations of System 2 are often associated with the subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration. Chapter 2. Attention and effort. Kahneman explores the concept of mental effort and how System 2 requires more effort than System 1. He discusses the limitations of attention and how cognitive load can affect our ability to think clearly and make rational decisions. Chapter 3. The Lazy Controller. This chapter delves into the tendency of System 2 to be lazy and rely on the intuitive judgments of System 1. Kahneman explains that this laziness can lead to biases and errors in judgment, as System 1 is more prone to biases. Chapter 4. The Associative Machine. Kahneman discusses how System 1 operates through associations, drawing on past experiences and memories to make quick judgments. He explains how these associations can lead to cognitive biases and affect our decision-making. Chapter 5. Cognitive Ease. Kahneman explores the concept of cognitive ease, the state of being in which our brain operates with minimal effort. He explains how cognitive ease can influence our judgments and decisions, often leading us to prefer familiar and simple solutions. Chapter 6. Norms, Surprises, and Causes. This chapter examines how System 1 establishes norms and expectations based on past experiences. Kahneman discusses how surprises and unexpected events can disrupt these norms and lead to more deliberate thinking by System 2. Chapter 7. A Machine for Jumping to Conclusions. Kahneman explores the tendency of System 1 to jump to conclusions based on limited information. He explains how this tendency can lead to errors and biases, as System 1 often relies on heuristics and shortcuts. Part 2. Heuristics and Biases. Chapter 8. How Judgments Happen. Kahneman introduces the concept of heuristics, the mental shortcuts that System 1 uses to make quick judgments. He explains how these heuristics can lead to systematic biases and errors. Chapter 9. Answering an Easier Question. Kahneman discusses how we often answer easier questions when faced with difficult ones. This substitution can lead to biases, as the answers to easier questions may not accurately reflect the complexities of the original problem. Chapter 10. The Law of Small Numbers. This chapter explores the biases that arise from relying on small samples of data. Kahneman explains how small sample sizes can lead to overgeneralizations and erroneous conclusions. Chapter 11. Anchors. Kahneman examines the anchoring effect, the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered, the anchor, when making decisions. He discusses how anchors can influence judgments and lead to biased outcomes. Chapter 12. The Science of Availability. This chapter explores the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples come to mind. Kahneman explains how this heuristic can lead to biases in risk perception and decision-making. Chapter 13. Availability, Emotion, and Risk. Kahneman discusses the interplay between availability, emotions, and risk perception. He explains how emotional responses can influence the availability of certain events in our minds, affecting our judgments and decisions. Chapter 14. Tom W.'s Specialty. This chapter examines the representativeness heuristic, the tendency to judge the probability of an event based on how similar it is to a typical case. Kahneman explains how this heuristic can lead to biases in probability judgments. Chapter 15. Linda, Less is More. Kahneman explores the conjunction fallacy, the tendency to judge the probability of two events occurring together as higher than the probability of one of the events occurring alone. He uses the famous Linda problem to illustrate this bias. Chapter 16. causes trump statistics. This chapter examines how causal explanations can overshadow statistical reasoning. Kahneman explains how our preference for causal narratives can lead to biases in understanding probabilities and risks. Chapter 17, Regression to the Mean. Kahneman discusses the concept of regression to the mean, the tendency for extreme values to return to the average over time. He explains how this statistical phenomenon can lead to biases in judgment and decision-making. Chapter 18, Taming Intuitive Predictions. This chapter explores how to correct for biases in intuitive predictions. Kahneman discusses techniques for improving the accuracy of predictions by taking into account statistical principles and reducing the influence of cognitive biases. Part 3, Overconfidence. Chapter 19, The Illusion of Understanding. Kahneman examines the illusion of understanding, the tendency to believe that we understand the past and can predict the future with greater accuracy than we actually can. He discusses how this illusion can lead to overconfidence and errors in judgment. Chapter 20, The Illusion of Validity. This chapter explores the illusion of validity, the tendency to overestimate the accuracy of our judgments and predictions. Kahneman explains how this bias can lead to overconfidence and poor decision-making. Chapter 21, Intuitions versus Formulas. Kahneman compares intuitive judgments with statistical formulas, arguing that formulas often outperform human intuition in making accurate predictions. He discusses the implications of this finding for decision-making in various fields. Chapter 22, Expert Intuition, When Can We Trust It? This chapter examines the conditions under which expert intuition can be trusted. Kahneman explains that expert intuition is reliable in environments that are predictable and where experts have had extensive practice. Chapter 23, The Outside View. Kahneman discusses the importance of taking the outside view, considering the base rates and statistical probabilities rather than relying solely on intuition. He explains how this approach can improve decision-making accuracy. Chapter 24, The Engine of Capitalism. This chapter explores the role of overconfidence in entrepreneurship and economic behavior. Kahneman explains how overconfidence can drive innovation and risk-taking, but also lead to failures and financial losses. Part 4, Choices. Chapter 25, Bernoulli's Errors. Kahneman examines the errors in traditional economic theories of rational choice, particularly those based on Bernoulli's expected utility theory. He introduces the concept of prospect theory as a more accurate model of decision-making under risk. Chapter 26, Prospect Theory. This chapter introduces prospect theory, which describes how people make decisions under risk. Kahneman explains how people evaluate potential gains and losses, often giving more weight to losses than gains. Chapter 27, The Endowment Effect. Kahneman explores the endowment effect, the tendency for people to value something more highly simply because they own it. He discusses the implications of this bias for economic behavior and decision-making. Chapter 28, Bad Events. This chapter examines how people respond to negative events and losses. Kahneman explains how loss aversion influences decision-making, leading people to avoid risks and prioritize avoiding losses over acquiring gains. Chapter 29, The Fourfold Pattern. Kahneman introduces the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes, explaining how people's preferences for risk vary depending on the probability and magnitude of potential outcomes. He discusses the implications of this pattern for understanding decision-making under risk. Chapter 30, Rare Events. This chapter explores how people perceive and respond to rare events. Kahneman explains how the availability, heuristic, and emotional responses can lead to biases in evaluating the likelihood and impact of rare events. Chapter 31, Risk Policies. Kahneman discusses strategies for improving decision-making under risk. He emphasizes the importance of developing risk policies that are consistent and based on statistical principles rather than intuition. Chapter 32, Keeping Score. This chapter examines how people keep track of gains and losses. Kahneman explains how mental accounting affects decision-making and financial behavior, often leading to irrational choices. Chapter 33, Reversals. Kahneman explores how changes in perspective can lead to reversals in preferences. He discusses how framing effects and the context in which choices are presented can influence decision-making. Chapter 34, Frames and Reality. This chapter examines how different frames can alter perceptions of reality and influence decisions. Kahneman discusses the importance of understanding and managing framing effects to improve decision-making. Part V, Two Selves. Chapter 35, Two Selves. Kahneman introduces the concept of the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives in the present and feels each moment, while the remembering self looks back and constructs a narrative of our experiences. He explains how these two selves can have different perspectives on happiness and satisfaction. Chapter 36, Life as a Story. This chapter explores how the remembering self creates stories from our experiences. Kahneman discusses how the peaks and endings of experiences have a disproportionate impact on how. Conclusion. Kahneman concludes by emphasizing the importance of being aware of the biases and heuristics that influence our thinking. By understanding the interplay between System 1 and System 2, and by recognizing the cognitive biases that shape our judgments and decisions, we can improve our decision-making and lead more rational, fulfilling lives. Final thoughts. Thinking Fast and Slow offers a profound understanding of human cognition and decision-making. Daniel Kahneman's insights into the dual systems of thought, cognitive biases, and heuristics provide a framework for improving our thinking and making better decisions. This comprehensive exploration of the mind's workings is essential reading for anyone interested in psychology, economics, and personal development. If you enjoyed this summary and found its content valuable, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.